Hey everyone, after an extended absence, the Digital Foundry Videocast is back. And yeah, we're going to be running a series of specials over the E3 period. But to begin with, to kind of get everything in shape and to ensure that we're ready to go, we're going to be doing this preview videocast. And to talk about it, our man on the show floor, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, how's it going this afternoon?
Not too bad. So, John, I'm going to be at base, and so is Tom Morgan. You are actually going to be flying to Los Angeles tomorrow, I believe.
That's right. So I've been spending the day getting ready to go, getting all the gear collected, which includes things like setting up this laptop that I'm going to be testing for the show to see if we can improve our video production process. I've got all the capture gear, the camera, the tripod, like a billion cables, SD cards, SSDs, you know, all the works. It's going to be a lot of gear.
Yeah, and the idea here is that for our Patreon supporters, we're going to be aiming to get you as many assets as possible over this period. So yeah, if you support us, we want to pay you back big time this time around. And also, if you're not currently sort of supporting the Patreon, do check it out, because we're going to have a ton of great stuff there. But I think from my perspective, John, a kind of game changer this time around is going to be that laptop that you've got there.
Yeah, that's right. So last year we were faced with issues in terms of, hey, we got to crunch video here, 4K video in particular. And well, last year they just didn't make any laptops that fit the bill. Most things were still dual core, occasionally quad core in the super high end range, and it just wasn't fast enough, so we had to pack a little machine. Whereas this year, I'm rolling with an MSI GS65, I think. Their Stealth Slim, or whatever you want to call it. We'll get the exact details on that later. But this thing is a 6-core i7 CPU based laptop with a GTX 1070 Max-Q in it.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, I think it's we're actually going to be doing a video on this specifically because, well, the problem is that for kind of mobile workflow, there's never really been laptops with enough horsepower to really get the job done, and at the same time, you know, have a GPU for playing games. Now, these new line of Max-Q GPUs and slim and light laptops, they're kind of really exciting, so we're going to be checking that out. But, you know, this is kind of like the ultimate sort of stress test, really, with the amount of assets we hope to pump out. But, well, let's talk about what we expect to see at E3, John, because, well, it's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm almost getting vibes that we could be looking at a little bit of an E3 2012 here. And by that I mean, this is like maybe the last major E3 before the next generation starts to become a thing. So we might actually be looking at some early, I guess, at this point, PC versions of games or cross-gen games, you know, that you can expect on like a PlayStation 5, theoretically.
Yeah, or indeed an Xbox 2.
yeah, exactly.
It's an interesting one because we do know some details about the Sony conference, which is specifically that they're going to be concentrating on 4 titles, and they're already titles that have been announced. Now, Spider-Man is coming out later this year. That's sort of, you know, guaranteed in the bag. We still haven't really seen so much on that one though, so I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Then there's The Last of Us 2, where we've barely seen anything on that. And then Death Stranding, which I'll tell you what, John, I just can't see this game being ready in the kind of PS4 time period.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. I mean, to me, I'm sure it will release on the PS4 because, you know, but I think that this feels like a perfect candidate for a cross-gen game. I mean, especially, imagine launching a PlayStation 5 with a game like this. Having a Kojima game at launch, I mean, that would be a huge thing for Sony. Kind of like, you know, Nintendo launching the Switch with a new Zelda game, which was also cross-gen. So, you know, I feel like it's a good candidate for it, at least in terms of the release schedule. And it's not the only one. There's also what Sucker Punch is doing, Ghosts of Tsushima, which, again, we really haven't seen a whole lot of thus far. And it's the kind of thing that does also maybe feel like a cross-gen game. Maybe. But at the same time, so beyond the games they're actually showing, you have to think some of the other Sony first-party studios are probably working on preliminary titles for the next generation, and that might be kind of why this conference is going to be so focused this year, because they're like, all right, well, let's just show what we've announced, because the stuff that we haven't announced is going to be targeting a platform we also haven't announced. Just my thoughts right now.
Well, there's a couple of things here from my perspective, which is that first of all, we have Sony not coming to the show with promises of many sort of new announcements at all. Maybe it'll be just third-party titles or whatnot. Now, the issue there, of course, is that we've recently had that investor call, I think it was an investor day actually, where Sony basically admitted that the era of the PlayStation 4 is coming to an end. And then there was some kind of weird 3-year window opened up about what they're going to be doing next, which has been interpreted as some as that we won't see the PlayStation 5 for 3 years. I don't believe that's the case. And you know, you and I both know that Sony love to announce their games early, and yet at this E3 they're not making any promises for new games, which I think is highly indicative.
So yeah, the conference I believe is called The Journey Begins, which, you know, it kind of feels like a two-part meaning there. I mean, sure, it's talking about the adventures in the games or whatever, but you gotta think it's like, okay, PlayStation 5 on the way. I mean,
it could be happening.
The thing is, though, is a lot of people seem confused when Sony was like, oh yeah, we envision the PS4 going on for another 3 years, but that makes perfect sense in the sense that they always go for that, you know, like the 10-year life cycle thing, or whatever you want to call it, where they support a new platform can launch and they still support the old one. It's happened with the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and the PS3, and there's no reason to think that the extremely successful PS4 will continue.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is like a massive installed user base there. I mean, if we think back to the PlayStation 3 and probably more specifically the PlayStation 2, which had that similar stratospheric success, they don't just, you know, cut support when they move on to the next platform. It's a kind of gradual transition thing. But this whole thing about The Journey Begins, you know, I'm going to be really interested to actually see if anybody gets any exec interviews there to talk to, you know, the people who are actually in charge, who know what's going on, and whether they will actually sort of talk about those statements that they made at the Investor Day, which, you know, it's pretty much, you know, there on paper. You know, they've said that the PlayStation 4 is coming to the natural end of its life cycle. I mean, you know, I've already done a video which talked about when Sony could deliver a generational leap, and it was quite interesting to see there was a lot of positive feedback to that video, but a lot of negative feedback, I think, to the concepts that the PlayStation 4 is kind of, you know, even contemplating that the PS4 is reaching the end of its life cycle, seemed to go down like a lead balloon. So I think Sony have got to be quite careful in how they handle this. And I just think that the number one interview question that people are going to be asking anybody that announces a new game at E3 this year will be, is it a cross-gen title? It's exactly as you say, what happened at E3 2012?
Exactly. And I think in some cases, obviously I don't think anybody's going to publicly make a statement about the PS5, but it's easy enough in this day and age to be like, oh yeah, we're targeting PC and, you know, thinking about consoles. But honestly, I understand the concern about the generation ending, because the PS4, it's doing well. I mean, the Xbox One as well, and there's the Switch. But even if the PS5 comes out late 2019, that still makes it basically the second longest console generation ever, if you think about it. So it's not exactly unprecedented. I mean, last gen honestly went on too long. I mean, you look at those late gen games, like you just did a video on Far Cry 3, and my thought is just like, it's clear that the developers wanted to do so much more, and they did it on the PC, but the consoles, they just couldn't do it. And you ended up with that mess.
And at the same time, we've got Nvidia that, you know, they've got their new 11 series, 20 series, whatever it's called, coming out fairly soon. And they're championing the sort of effects like ray tracing, which is just not going to happen at all in anything like what we saw at GDC on current gen machines. And even next gen, it might be difficult for them to get that kind of effect. But I think there was a kind of very positive reaction from developers there to the RTX technology that we saw there. And I think they're kind of hungry for new technology to really sort of push things forward. And that's kind of like, interesting, because at the end of the day, it's the developers that are kind of in pole position here. They're the guys who are actually pushing new technologies, new boundaries and whatnot. But at the same time, I can entirely see why people don't think we're ready for the next generation. So, let's look at that Sony conference that's coming up. Last of Us 2, Death Stranding. There could be some really, really impressive stuff there which pushes the PS4 in directions that we haven't seen yet. But at the same time, there always comes a point where, Sony, Microsoft, whoever, they kind of just call time on the generation. And all of those concepts that work so well, that are pushing the PlayStation 4, they actually become, almost like the starting point for what's going to happen next gen.
It actually kind of makes me think, though, of the statement Shavat Yearly made about Crysis 3, if you recall, where he was like, yeah, Crysis 3 is already next gen. And he was kind of right in that it really did represent what we could kind of expect from those consoles. And so I think we're at the stage again where we're starting to see the developers just pining to make more advanced games, or at least, have additional hardware at the disposal. But what you said about Nvidia is interesting, because if we start to see a push towards the RTX stuff, like, that's such a fundamental shift in terms of what you can do with lighting and general rendering as a whole, that it kind of puts the PC in this position where all of a sudden it has something that the consoles just can't even begin to touch, because I don't think it's going to happen. And so, not that everybody on the PC is suddenly going to have, the 11 or 20 series or whatever it is at their disposal, mind you, but if at the beginning of this new generation, there's already a video card that's been out that can support ray tracing, it's only going to accelerate over time. And it'll be curious to see what impact this has on multi-platform development. And in fact, if you want to think even back in a different way, where does this leave the Nintendo Switch? Because we're at this point, the Switch is hugely successful. We're at a point where some games can be converted to run on the Switch. And the conversions take a noticeable hit often, but fundamentally you can get those games on the Switch. Doom and Wolfenstein, I think, are a great example of this. But there's some upper end AAA titles now. I don't think you could see Assassin's Creed Origins on the Switch, for instance. So what happens when you jump to the PlayStation 5 or whatever Microsoft has coming next? Once again, the Switch is too new. It's not going to be abandoned, but you're left with this massive gap in power, where now it's back to the same situation that Nintendo's been in so many times, where you can't just take a PS5 game and put it on the Switch. It's going to have to be a different game, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, already we're seeing that the Switch is getting kind of like a subset of ports. You're not getting the full multi-platform experience on that platform. Now, my hope is that because the Switch has kind of established itself as a viable platform now, that developers will, actually do new games specific to that platform as opposed to ports. Now, I'm still a firm advocate of Switch ports, because I think it's kind of really helped to bulk up the software library on that platform, and it's been massively exciting to see so many of my favorite games transition into, a mobile form factor. But again, I think it's going to be a case where hopefully the Switch at that point won't need to keep up in any sort of way, shape or form with the technological arms race that's going on, that will be going on between Microsoft and Sony, and I honestly think Nvidia. I think, they're doing some amazing stuff there. I think interesting position for Microsoft to be in. We haven't really talked about Microsoft. Now, there is a possibility, let's put it that way, that a PlayStation 5 could release in holiday 2019. I mean, that was the point of my video, that the available technologies will be there for Sony to make that generational leap versus the base PlayStation 4. And, you know, by that time, the console would be, you know, 6 years old. That's kind of, you know, as you said, that's a pretty decent vintage for a console generation. But Microsoft, I thought at the time they would have to follow suit when Sony produces a new console. So if it's 2019, they'll have to go then. If it's 2020, they'll have to go then. But the issue they've got there is, of course, Xbox One X, which only came out last year. And so producing a new console in 2019, I'm sure they could do it. You know, they've got more money than Sony, you know, and they've got a massively fantastic team of engineers there, and they could do it. The question is whether it's going to kind of annoy the user base, the hardcore Xbox users who've invested in the X, and they kind of don't think that a new console is kind of right. I mean, maybe in 2020 they could get away with it, then there'd be a 3-year gap. 2019, no, difficult one.
Yeah, that is tricky. On one hand, I think what the X has taught me is that the Xbox fans do value power above all else. That's kind of what the Xbox was built on, right? I mean, the Xbox was significantly more powerful than the competition. I'd argue the 360 was superior to all of the consoles of that generation. And so, you know, the Xbox One backlash kind of had a lot to do with the fact that it just felt like a weird turn for Microsoft. And so the X kind of got them back to where they needed to be. So if it did come 2 years later, would the hardcore Xbox fans really care? Or would they just be excited to have another powerful machine under their belt? And at the same time, maybe then the X becomes the new base platform and the original Xbox One is just, you know, no longer supported, kind of like, you know, smartphone generations.
Yeah, there's a good argument there. I think the question is the extent to which the CPU is actually going to be able to hack it once those new machines are out with presumably Ryzen technology. I mean, we saw that story recently of a Sony engineer who is working with Ryzen in the developer toolchain, so it kind of does strongly suggest, A, that they're both going to be sticking with AMD. I can't see them moving, and certainly Sony at least, and B, that you know, things are happening in the here and now that are kind of indicative that work is indeed quite far progressed on the next gen machine, certainly on the Sony side. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think from Microsoft's perspective, they've kind of got other statements to make that are kind of more significant, specifically, well, that they actually have games.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, right now we you know, for the Microsoft side, I believe we've heard that their press conference is going to be 2 hours.
Wow.
Is that right? So like a 2-hour press conference promising that up front. I don't know anything about what's going to be shown yet. I think it's been pretty quiet. We've heard some leaks about things here and there, but it feels like this is the year where they really need to come out swinging with just like as much software as they can, because, you know, the X itself is amazing hardware, but, you know, there's been a few stumbles this year with some of the, you know, first party titles, which, you know, like State of Decay 2, for instance. It's an interesting game, but I don't think I mean, it was never intended to be something like an equivalent of a big AAA title. I mean, it's an indie game, and it's a cool, interesting indie game, but I think some places, you know, viewed like, well, Microsoft doesn't have a lot of first-party stuff, so we're gonna prop up State of Decay 2. And I think that kind of does a disservice to everyone when you take an indie game like that and try to make it seem like a AAA game,
right,
when it's not. So I'm hoping that Microsoft can kind of fire back here, because for a while we know that they were kind of divesting themselves of first-party development, but then, you know, I've read enough that makes it sound like once Phil Spencer came in and, you know, they thought about it, and maybe they have been working on big first-party titles again, but if you just started that up, you know, 2-something years ago, it takes time to make a game, right? So that, which would explain why we've seen nothing. So this could be a year to actually see some fruits of that.
I mean, you know, we're talking about the whole cross-gen situation. Microsoft are actually in a pretty easy position here, because Xbox also sort of encompasses the Windows Store. so they can roll out whatever they like on PC, and you know, they can get around it that way, which ironically, of course, flashback to E3 2012 when we saw games like Watch Dogs, for example, which, you know, simply wouldn't have been possible on 360 level hardware. And in actual fact, we actually saw what was possible with Watch Dogs on
yes.
360.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, it was evil. It was frankly evil. But the point is that, you know, you can, if you're a third party, say, hey, we got this amazing thing coming in a couple of years. Here's an early look. It's running in real time on PC. And, you know, no problem. Everybody kind of understands what you mean at that point. On the Microsoft side, they are fully sort of embedded in the PC space. You know, they run Windows, so it's you know, perfectly fine. But of course, the question is going to be, you know, as you say, what happens to the Xbox One? And yeah, I mean, we've got issues at the moment, I think, with the Xbox One S. If we take a look at the Far Cry 3 Classic, for example, the performance there isn't really good enough, and you know, it is okay on virtually every other platform. And then we look at Onrush, which doesn't have a high frame rate mode on the base Xbox One, but it does on all of the others. There's the sense already of momentum moving away from the S, and I kind of don't like it. But, you know, there are realities there in terms of development. It's not as if the Onrush guys are sitting there thinking, oh yeah, we'll just stiff, you know, one of our SKUs. That's not the way it happens.
Exactly. Talking to them, I mean, they've been pouring a lot of effort into the base Xbox One version, like really trying to squeeze that extra performance out of it. But it's difficult, and it's a combination from talking to different developers of the tools themselves and the limitations there, and of course the hardware. And obviously the Xbox One X is powerful enough to kind of overcome those limitations, but the regular Xbox One, clearly it's not. But honestly, you know, the thing I want to see again from Microsoft, it's either up already or we're putting it up soon. I did a video on Halo 2 at E3 2003 and the impact that had, and it just reminded me of what it was like, you know, at a Microsoft conference to have something like that, something so cool and memorable that you just, you know, people still talk about that to this day. That kind of impact. That's the thing that I think the Xbox fan base really wants and kind of deserves at this point, is something to hang their hat on, a demonstration, a game, something like that, where you're just like, whoa, that looks, that's incredible.
Yeah, I think, you know, to be fair, the Coalition haven't been sitting about doing nothing. These guys, these guys have produced, I think, you know, I agree with you. Gears of War 4 is kind of like one of the unsung heroes of this generation, and easily one of the most technologically advanced games of the current console generation.
Big time.
So, you know, what have those guys been up to? I want to know. That should be there, you know, something, if it's a new Gears game, if it's something completely different, that should be there at E3. And then you've got, of course, there are certain, you know, to be fair to Microsoft, in a world of constant delays, they have that Forza franchise that always delivers every year. You can set your clock by it. And, well, this year, of course, it's going to be Playground Games with what we assume will be Forza Horizon 4. Yeah, and, you know, this, of course, will be their first game where they've been able to concentrate efforts on Xbox One X as well. So, yeah, I really want to see that. So, you know, Microsoft do have an issue in terms of delivering first-party games that people actually want to play. And, you know, if you look back over the last few months, it's been spotty, to say the least. State of Decay, you're right, it shouldn't have been marketed as a AAA title. Sea of Thieves, that was just, you know, a really awesome game, but, you know, there was nothing there that kind of made you want to come back to it several weeks on. And then we go back to PUBG, which was kind of like their Christmas gambit, and, you know, it's kind of been sort of, well, how can you put it? Fortnite is the game now. I don't think there's so much emphasis now on PUBG, and it's still got all of those technical issues. So yeah, I mean, Microsoft are on a poor run at the moment. I don't think you can deny that. But, you know, when you've got the likes of Playground Games and the Coalition in your back pocket, you can't rule them out, and I'm really looking forward to what they're going to have at E3.
I'm always excited to get out there. There's going to be some new stuff to see, I think. I mean, I'm sure we're going to see Anthem gameplay during Microsoft's conference. We might see something like Cyberpunk from CD Projekt Red, since The Witcher 3 kind of had its gameplay debut at an Xbox conference. I mean, stuff like that could also show up there, which would be an awesome thing to demonstrate at a show like this. And you know, that's really the kind of reveal stuff that I enjoy the most, and I'm kind of excited to see what shows up during all these conferences. But we're going to find out soon, because the show kicks off, it just feels like everything starts earlier and earlier, but Saturday morning, got to be up and over in Hollywood for a visit to EA Play. And we'll see if they can kind of, you know, put on a slightly better show this year, since last year was a little bit, you know, they had some of the YouTuber guys in there, and maybe they're not used to being up on stage.
Again, if we talk about EA just for a second before we close this off, remember Battlefield 3? It was like a kind of test run for the next generation.
Yes.
Before the next generation actually happened.
Yes.
And yeah, never discount, you know, what the guys, what Johan Anderson and the Seed guys are doing on the Frostbite engine. Hopefully we're going to be seeing something there. And of course, I believe they did a ray tracing demo.
They did.
So I'm going to be interested to see if there's any kind of announcements on RTX there, and a possible collaboration. Maybe it will happen in Battlefield 5, who knows? But yeah, it's, you know, on the one hand, when you look at the stuff like the Sony lineup, where they're, you know, literally just going to be showing us games that they've already announced, you think to yourself, is this going to be a good E3? But the more you think about it and the deeper you dig, then there's going to be a lot of exciting stuff there. And yeah, of course, John's going to be there to kind of check it all out, and we'll try and get you impressions as soon as we can. But I think, John, thanks for that. I think we're going to wrap it up now.
Yep, sounds good, Rich. I will talk to you next on the other side.
Awesome. So please do like and subscribe to support everything we do here at Digital Foundry. Yes, please do consider supporting the Patreon. There's going to be some exciting stuff happening there during the E3 time. And yes, please do ring the bell if you are a subscriber, because there's sort of this huge issue going on at the moment where even if you've subscribed, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to see our stuff, which defies logic from my perspective, but there it is. Anyway, that's it. We're signing off now. See you at E3. Thanks for watching.